What happens to a world when it disappears so completely that only its name survives? Not the streets, not the voices, not the small everyday quarrels that once filled its harbours. Only a name, drifting through centuries like a piece of driftwood that no one can quite identify. There is something almost unbearable in that thought, and yet it is the thought that opens every serious encounter with the story of Atlantis. A whole civilization supposedly swallowed in a single dreadful interval of misfortune. A whole memory thinned down to a few pages in a Greek philosopher's notebook. And around that thinning, a fog that has never quite lifted, no matter how many ships have sailed across it, no matter how many divers have descended into it, no matter how many scholars have tried to dispel it with footnotes and patient arguments. So before letting the body sink fully into this comfort, before the lamp dims and the night wraps itself around the room, perhaps there is a small gesture worth making, a gentle press of approval, a quiet act of subscription, but only if there is real fondness here, real interest in this slow wandering through old mysteries. And if it feels right, a whisper of where the listening is happening tonight. A city, a village, a coastline, a quiet apartment in some sleeping hour. The hour itself is part of the magic, because Atlantis has always belonged to those in-between times, when the mind is loose enough to wonder and stubborn enough to question. The strangeness begins not with the question of whether Atlantis existed, but with the simple observation that the question refuses to die. Empires have risen and fallen, religions have been replaced, languages have gone extinct, and still, in every century and every language that bothered to keep up, somebody is asking again, where was it? Did it sink? Did it burn? Did it ever stand at all? The persistence is itself a kind of evidence, though not the kind that fits cleanly into any archive. It is evidence that something in the human mind cannot let go of the idea of a vanished world. Not a city that fell to invaders, not a village swept away by a single flood. A world, complete, capable, and then gone. There is a peculiar weight in that distinction. Ruins of fallen empires are everywhere after all. Tourists walk through them with cameras and bottled water. Archaeologists number their stones. They carry plaques, guidebooks, polite explanations. But Atlantis has no plaque. It has no agreed coastline, no excavation, no museum hall lined with its pottery. And precisely because of that it occupies a stranger position in the imagination than any properly verified ruin ever could. It is not a place that was lost. It is a place that has refused to be found. Most of what later generations think they know about it traces back to two unfinished dialogues by Plato, written in the 4th century before the Common Era. Two pieces of writing no more, and yet from them an entire mythology has bloomed across more than 2,000 years. That ratio alone is worth pausing on. So little ink, so much aftermath. As if the story were too small to be a fact and too large to be a fiction, and so it grew sideways into every gap the centuries offered it. And the centuries offered many. The trail through that growth is not straight. It bends through Egyptian temples and medieval maps, through Renaissance speculations and Victorian seances, through ice cores from Greenland and submerged villages off Israeli coasts, through standing stones in Brittany and circular geological formations in the Sahara. Each turn raises the same uneasy question. How much of what was once known has slipped beneath some surface? Water, sand, doctrine, simple forgetting? And how much of what survives is only the shape of the loss, the silhouette where something used to stand? There is also the discomfort of admitting how recent some forms of confidence really are. The certainty that civilization began in a few river valleys and spread outward in a tidy sequence is younger than many people realize. Each decade the boundaries move backward. A site once called impossible is dated, then redated, then accepted with the quiet embarrassment of a discipline that has been wrong before and will likely be wrong again. The ground keeps shifting underneath the textbooks, and the textbooks, to their credit, keep being rewritten. but each rewriting carries the faint admission that some earlier version had spoken too soon. Perhaps the most honest place to begin, then, is not with belief or dismissal, but with a softer question. What kind of world produces a story like Atlantis and refuses to let it die? A world rich in catastrophe, certainly. A world in which coastlines move, climates lurch, languages forget themselves, and the dead leave behind monuments their descendants can no longer read. A world, in other words, very much like the one that lies under the feet of every modern listener, beneath the smooth surface of school timelines and tourist maps. Underneath that smoothness, the ground is older and more wounded than it looks. Tonight the journey moves slowly into that wounded ground, not towards a single answer, because the subject does not allow for one. Toward a series of mists, each one thinner than expected, each one revealing not the lost city but something stranger, the long, patient outline of everything humanity has tried to remember and almost succeeded in forgetting. And somewhere in that outline, perhaps, the trace of a memory that does not quite belong to any single people, yet seems to belong to all of them, a trace that no flood has fully washed away, no empire has fully erased, no philosopher has fully invented. The first lamp in this descent waits in ancient Greece, in the unfinished pages of a man who wrote about justice and the soul and somehow could not stop himself from describing an island. There is a quiet irony in the fact that the most enduring lost city in human imagination first appeared not in a sailor's log or a temple inscription, but in the careful prose of a philosopher who otherwise spent his life arguing that the visible world was less real than the world of ideas. Plato did not, on the surface, seem like the sort of man to leave behind a treasure map. He was suspicious of poets, doubtful of unexamined opinions, and famously committed to the slow, almost merciless discipline of dialogue. And yet somewhere in the middle of his late writings, between meditations on cosmology and the proper ordering of cities, he opened a door onto an island so detailed that 23 centuries of readers have been unable to agree whether it was meant to be walked through or merely admired from the threshold. The two dialogues in question, the Timaeus and the Critias, do not announce themselves as adventure stories. They begin in conversation, in that distinctly Platonic atmosphere where men sit down with one another and speak of the universe as if it were a problem to be solved over the afternoon. Yet, within a few pages of the Timaeus, the conversation drifts towards a tale that one of the speakers, Critias, claims to have inherited from his grandfather, who heard it from Solon, who heard it from priests in Egypt, a chain of transmission so polished, so deliberately laid out, that it almost dares the reader to test it. 4 mouths between the modern listener and the original source, and at the far end of that chain, a sunken civilization beyond the pillars of Heracles. It is easy even now to feel the strange pressure of that opening. A philosopher whose other works move comfortably between abstraction and analogy suddenly stops to describe an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. He gives it kings, 10 of them, descended from Poseidon and a mortal woman named Cleito. He arranges its capital in concentric rings of land and sea. He measures its plain, names its mountains, describes the metals plating its walls, orichalcum gleaming on the inner ring, a substance that itself has fascinated metallurgists and skeptics alike. He notes its harbours, its canals, its temples, its army. He even pauses on the rituals of its kings, who would gather in the temple of Poseidon, sacrifice a bull and swear oaths inscribed on a column of orichalcum. None of this reads like the casual sketching of a parable. It reads like someone holding a memory in his hand and turning it carefully under a lamp, and yet the suspicion has always been there. Plato was, after all, a master of constructed worlds. The Republic gave him an ideal city. The laws gave him another. Why should Atlantis not simply be a third, a city built to be destroyed, a foil designed to make a different kind of point about pride, expansion, and the slow corruption of even the most magnificent state. The structure of the tale fits that suspicion almost too well. A wealthy maritime power grows arrogant. It launches an unjust war. It is resisted by a virtuous, austere prehistoric Athens. It is then swallowed in a single day and night by an angry sea. The shape of the story is in some ways a moral diagram with topography painted on top of it. But here the doubt itself begins to deepen because the Critias breaks off mid-sentence. The dialogue that was supposed to deliver the full account stops abruptly, leaving the destruction unwritten, the fall undescribed. Whatever Plato intended to say last, he did not say, and that silence has unsettled readers ever since. A philosopher who had carefully prepared the architectural detail of an entire civilization simply lays down his pen before the catastrophe arrives. Some have read this as evidence that he could not finish what he'd started. Others have read it as the careful caution of a man whose source material had run out. The truth is likely simpler and more uncomfortable. No one knows. What is certain is that Plato did not present the story as a fable. In the Timaeus, the speaker insists that the account is true, though strange. That single phrase has done enormous damage to the comfortable view that Atlantis is pure invention. A philosopher who routinely flagged his myths as myths chose, in this case, to flag the tale as factual. He could have done otherwise. He could have framed it as allegory, as he framed so many other stories in his vast body of work. He did not. Whether that choice was a literary device, a sincere conviction, or something more layered, the choice itself remains. There are details that complicate the easy dismissal even further. The figure of Solon, the Athenian lawgiver who supposedly received the story from Egyptian priests, was a real historical person. His travels in Egypt were a known feature of his biography long before Plato. The city of Sais, where the conversation is said to have taken place, was a real religious centre with a long-standing temple to a goddess the Greeks identified with Athena. The claim that Egyptian priesthoods preserved records older than anything the Greeks remembered was not a Platonic eccentricity. It was a widespread Greek assumption, repeated by Herodotus and others, who treated Egyptian antiquity as the gold standard of long memory. Plato did not invent the prestige of Egyptian record-keeping. He inherited it. Whether he used it as a literary frame or as a genuine source of older material is precisely the question that cannot be settled. And then, of course, there is the date. 9,000 years before Solon, the priests are said to have told him, which would place the destruction of Atlantis somewhere around 9,600 before the Common Era, deep in the very period that modern paleoclimatology has begun to recognize as one of the most turbulent in the recent history of the planet. A date that, when Plato wrote it, must have seemed almost absurdly remote. A date that, in his own time, no Greek tradition could verify. A date that somehow lands suspiciously close to events the ancient world should have had no way of knowing about. Whether by accident, invention, or inheritance, the philosopher had set down a number that the next 2 millennia would not stop circling. And the longer that number is studied, the harder it becomes to decide whether it is an error, a flourish, or a fragment of something older that he himself only half understood. The door he opened in those 2 dialogues did not lead anywhere obvious. It led instead deeper into Egypt, into a temple, into a conversation, into the strange claim that the Greeks had forgotten more than they knew. The strangest line in the entire Atlantis account is not the description of the rings, nor the catalogue of metals, nor even the date that hovers improbably at the edge of recorded time. It is a quiet rebuke delivered by an old Egyptian priest to a visiting Greek lawgiver, somewhere in the temple precinct of Sais, late in the 6th century before the Common Era. The priest, according to Plato, looks at Solon and tells him almost gently that the Greeks are like children. They have no old men among them. They remember only one flood, only one age, only the latest layer of a far longer history. They mistake their youth for the world's youth, and in doing so, They walk through ruins without recognizing them. It is a line that shouldn't be possible to forget, and yet it is the line most often skipped in popular retellings because it complicates everything that follows. If the priest was right, even partly right, even metaphorically right, then the entire Greek understanding of the past was a thin layer floating over something much deeper. And if the Greeks could not see that deeper layer, what guarantee does any later civilization have that it can see its own? The setting itself deserves a moment of attention. Sais was not an obscure village. It was one of the great religious centres of Lower Egypt, dedicated to the goddess Neith, whom the Greeks would later identify with Athena. Its priesthood was famous in antiquity for its archives, its astronomical knowledge, and its claims to chronological depth. Herodotus, writing roughly a century before Plato, visited Egypt himself and came away with a similar impression, that the priest there spoke of dynasties stretching back through tens of thousands of years, dwarfing any timeline a Greek could reasonably claim. He too was told that Greek memory was shallow. He too recorded the rebuke and seemed unable to entirely shake it off. This was not then a private Platonic fantasy. It was a recurring theme in Greek encounters with Egyptian antiquity, and it raises a question that has never been comfortably answered. What did those Egyptian priesthoods actually believe they were preserving? Were the long chronologies they cited symbolic, mythical, dynastic in some ritual sense? Or did they encode, however imperfectly, a memory of human time deeper than what the Greeks could imagine? The honest answer is that no one knows for certain, because the temple archives the priests claim to consult have not survived. What survives are the Greek reports of what the priest said, filtered through writers who were already half sceptical and half dazzled. The priest's accusation has a particular sting because it is not a claim about Atlantis specifically. It is a claim about forgetting. He tells Solon that civilizations have been destroyed many times by fire and by water, and that only certain regions, those protected by particular geographies, preserve any continuous record across these breaks. Egypt, sheltered by the steady rhythm of the Nile, kept its memory. Greece, more exposed to upheaval, lost its own. The story of Atlantis is offered almost as a proof of this larger thesis. Here is something, the priest is saying, that you yourselves did once, and you do not even remember doing it. Your ancestors, before the catastrophe, stood against an empire from beyond the Pillars of Heracles. You preserved nothing of that victory. We preserved it for you. It is on the surface an extraordinary claim, but beneath the surface it points to something even stranger. The priest is suggesting that cultural memory has a half-life, that entire ages can be erased, not because no one survives, but because the survivors are too few and too scattered to maintain literacy, ritual, and continuity. After such breaks, humanity does not vanish. It begins again, simpler than before, in mountainous refuges or on the edges of former coastlines, and it slowly rebuilds. But it rebuilds without knowing what it is rebuilding upon. The new world rises on the silent foundations of an older one whose name is no longer remembered. This is where the conversation in Sais begins to feel less like myth and more like something that should be examined seriously, even if cautiously. Modern archaeology has, in its own way, vindicated parts of the pre-structural argument, even while remaining skeptical of his specifics. There have been collapses. The Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean fell within roughly a century, around 1177 before the Common Era, and many of their successors had to relearn writing from scratch. The Indus Valley cities were abandoned and their script remains undeciphered to this day. Mycenaean Greek civilization vanished so thoroughly that the later Greeks who built the classical world had no clear idea what the great citadels of Mycenaean Tiryns had once been, attributing them instead to mythical cyclopes. Forgetting, in other words, is not a hypothetical risk. It is a documented pattern. If forgetting on that scale could happen within recorded history, what is the upper limit? At what point does the loss become invisible to its own descendants? The priest of Sais was, in effect, asking precisely this question 2,500 years ago. and the answer he offered was uncomfortable then and remains uncomfortable now. There is no upper limit. There is only what a particular tradition happens to preserve, and the rest dissolves into legend, into ritual, into half-remembered images that later generations cannot distinguish from invention. There is also something to be said about why Egypt, of all places, would have been chosen as the keeper of such a memory. The geography itself made continuity possible in a way that few other ancient civilizations enjoyed. The Nile flooded predictably, the desert sealed the borders, and the political centre could survive interruptions that would have shattered more fragile states. While much of the Mediterranean world cycled through invasions and dark ages, Egypt rebuilt itself again and again on the same template, with the same gods, the same calendar, the same ritual cycles. To a Greek visitor in the 6th century before the Common Era, Egypt would have looked almost geological in its persistence, a place where time itself moved more slowly, where archives accumulated layer by layer, where it was at least conceivable that a memory from 9,000 years earlier might still be lodged somewhere in the dust of a temple library. Whether such a memory actually survived is of course the unanswerable question. The library at Alexandria, the great repository where so much Egyptian and Greek learning eventually pooled together, did not survive. Its losses were partial and gradual, but real, and what was lost cannot be reconstructed from the silence it left behind. Whatever the priests of Sais may have known, whatever scrolls they may have consulted, whatever older traditions they may have drawn upon when they spoke to Solon, all of that has either crumbled into dust or been carried away by hands whose names history did not bother to record. The priest's voice, then, comes down through Plato like a rumour of a rumour, and yet it carries, even now, the weight of a warning that no later century has fully managed to escape. The warning from Sais, if it was ever truly delivered, leaves a strange residue on the mind. It implies that disasters severe enough to erase whole civilizations have happened more than once, and that some of them lie far beyond the reach of any written record. For most of human history, that claim could be neither proven nor disproven. It floated in the air of myth, attached to flood stories and fire stories and stories of skies that grew dark and seasons that failed. It was the kind of claim that serious historians filed away politely, and serious geologists rarely touched at all. And then, sometime in the second half of the 20th century, the ice itself began to speak. The ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, it turned out, were not silent witnesses. They were archives. Each year of snowfall pressed down on the year beneath it, trapping pockets of ancient air, fragments of dust, traces of pollen, and the faint chemical fingerprints of distant volcanic eruptions. When researchers began drilling cores through these sheets, what they pulled up was, in effect, a continuous tape recording of the planet's atmosphere, stretching back tens of thousands of years. And one section of that recording, when it was finally read carefully, sent a quiet shock through the discipline. Around 12,900 years before the present, the temperature in the North Atlantic region did something it was not supposed to do. It dropped. Suddenly. Severely. And then, after roughly 1,200 years of biting cold, it rose again with a violence that was almost more disturbing than the cold itself. This event came to be called the Younger Dryas, named after a small Arctic flower whose pollen marked the cold layer in European sediments. The name is botanical and harmless, almost decorative. The thing it describes was not. Some of the records suggest that, at the end of the cold period, regional warming of 7 degrees Celsius occurred in roughly 50 years, and possibly faster in some places. To a modern reader who has grown up associating climate change with slow centuries and gradual graphs, that timescale is genuinely difficult to absorb. Within a single human lifetime, the world would have shifted from one regime to another, and there would have been no way for anyone living through it to understand what was happening or why. The cause is still debated. The leading explanation involves vast pulses of meltwater released from the retreating North American ice sheets, freshening the surface of the North Atlantic and disrupting the great conveyor of ocean circulation that normally carries warmth northward. Without that warmth, the surrounding regions plunged back towards glacial conditions, even as the rest of the planet was emerging from the last ice age. A more controversial hypothesis proposes a cosmic impact, a fragmenting comet whose airbursts and ground strikes might have destabilized ice sheets and ignited continent-wide fires. The evidence for this hypothesis is contested, and most mainstream researchers remain skeptical. But the very fact that the debate continues, decades after it began, testifies to how strange and how sudden the event was. What is not debated is that something happened. Sediments record it, ice records it, pollen records it, lake deposits in Europe, ocean cores in the Atlantic, cave formations across continents. All preserve the same fingerprint of an abrupt cooling followed by an even more abrupt warming. Whatever its cause, the Younger Dryas was real, and it occurred at precisely the moment when human beings were beginning the slow transition from the deep Pleistocene world into something resembling the conditions of the present. It was not a small disturbance at the edge of prehistory. It was a planetary lurch happening directly underneath the feet of communities that had no calendars, no thermometers, and no way to explain what was unfolding around them. There is a quiet vertigo in placing oneself, even imaginatively, inside that interval. The familiar landmarks of a generation would have begun to fail. Animals that had migrated through certain valleys for centuries would have changed their routes. Plants that had ripened reliably in certain seasons would have stopped appearing. Coastlines, already in motion from the larger glacial melt, would have continued shifting in ways that defeated the memory of grandparents. And then, just as the cold seemed to be settling in as a new normal, the warmth would have returned, faster than expected, dissolving ice that had stood for centuries and unleashing further floods, further migrations, further losses of place. People living through such a time would not have called it the Younger Dryas. They would have had no name for it at all, only the lived sensation of a world that had stopped behaving the way the old stories said it should. It is precisely this sensation, perhaps, that lingers in the strange family of myths scattered across the ancient world. Stories of an age destroyed, stories of survivors clinging to mountains while waters rose, stories of darkness that lasted too long, of suns that dimmed, of skies that became unreliable. Such stories were once dismissed as theological flourishes, the sort of thing pre-scientific peoples invented because they did not understand weather. The ice cores have made that dismissal harder to sustain. There was something at the threshold of the Holocene that human beings had every reason to remember and every reason to fear. The Younger Dryas does not, by itself, prove anything about Atlantis. It does not deliver a sunken city, a ringed capital, a column of orichalcum. What it does is more subtle and in some ways more unsettling. It restores plausibility to a category of memory that the modern world had grown comfortable rejecting. It suggests that the deep past was not a smooth ramp leading gently up towards civilization, but a fractured terrain, marked by interruptions severe enough to break the continuity of human experience. And it situates the date that Plato's Egyptian priest gave for the destruction of Atlantis, roughly 9,600 years before the Common Era, almost exactly at the closing edge of this turbulent interval. Whether that alignment is coincidence or echo is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. But the alignment itself is real, and it is difficult to look at it without a faint, unwelcome chill. There is also the question of what such an event would have done to coastal populations specifically, since coastlines are where human beings have always preferred to live. The melting of the great ice sheets did not stop during the Younger Dryas, it only slowed. Sea levels, which had already risen substantially from their glacial low, continued their long climb, and after the cold interval ended, the rise accelerated again. Whatever communities had established themselves along the shores of the Pleistocene world would have spent generation after generation watching their land disappear, their fishing grounds rearrange, their familiar harbours fill with salt water that did not retreat. The destruction would not have been a single dramatic wave, but a slow, relentless siege, punctuated by occasional catastrophes that would have lodged themselves in oral memory, like wounds that never healed cleanly. Somewhere beneath the modern shoreline, in the silt and sand of those drowned generations, the question of what was lost remains open. The ice has spoken. The water perhaps still has more to say. The water, when it finally settled into something resembling its modern position, had taken more than the eye can easily measure. The number that geologists offer is, on its face, almost too clean to register. Somewhere around 120 metres of vertical rise between the depths of the last glacial maximum and the relatively stable shorelines of the present. A flat number, the kind that fits comfortably into a textbook. But verticals are deceiving when one is speaking of coastlines. A small rise in elevation applied to a gently sloping shelf swallows enormous distances of land. Whole regions that had been habitable plains, river deltas, hunting grounds, fishing villages, all of it slid quietly beneath a sea that was not, at any single moment, behaving dramatically. The drama lay in the cumulative arithmetic. Year by year the line moved inland. Generation by generation, places that had once been remembered as inland became coastal, and places that had once been coastal became seabed. What is striking is how much of the world this transformation actually touched. The continental shelves, those broad underwater plains that surround every continent, were not always underwater. During the long cold of the last ice age, they stood exposed, dry, and in many cases biologically rich. The shelf around what is now the British Isles connected to mainland Europe across a vast lowland that researchers have come to call Doggerland, a real territory mapped through marine geophysics. Sediment cores and the occasional tooth or hand axe dredged up by fishing trawlers. The shelf off the eastern coast of North America extended much farther than the present shoreline suggests, harbouring rivers and forests that no human eye has seen in more than 10,000 years. The Persian Gulf was largely a fertile valley, watered by the Tigris and Euphrates and their now vanished tributaries. The Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia formed a single vast subcontinent connecting Java and Sumatra and Borneo to the mainland, a landscape larger than India that has now disappeared almost entirely under shallow tropical seas. These were not marginal places, they were in many cases exactly the kinds of environments that human beings have historically preferred. Mild, well-watered, full of game, easy to traverse. If one were trying to imagine where late Pleistocene populations actually lived, the answer would not be the rugged interior highlands that dominate most archaeological maps. It would be the river mouths, the lagoons, the broad estuaries, the gently sloping coasts where shellfish were abundant and migration routes converged. And those are precisely the places that are now beyond ordinary archaeological reach. Buried under sediment, scoured by currents, occasionally glimpsed through expensive marine surveys, but never excavated with anything like the patience and thoroughness that land sites receive. This creates a peculiar situation in the discipline. The places where the most evidence of early coastal civilization should logically exist are the places where it is hardest to look. And the places where it is easiest to look, the inland sites preserved by accident on dry, stable ground, are not necessarily representative of how most people actually lived. The archaeological record, in other words, is not a balanced sample of the past, it is a heavily biased sample, weighted toward whatever happened to survive on land that did not move. Anything that happened on land that did move, that drowned, that were eroded into the sea, is largely lost, and what remains is fragmentary at best. There is a thought experiment worth performing here. Imagine a future archaeologist 10,000 years from now, attempting to reconstruct 21st century human civilization, but with one strict limitation. They're only allowed to examine sites that currently lie at elevations of 200 meters or higher. Most of the world's major cities would be invisible to them. The great ports, the coastal capitals, the densely populated river deltas, none of them would appear in the record. They would find mountain villages, alpine resorts, scattered highland settlements, perhaps a few inland industrial towns. From this evidence, they would be expected to deduce the existence of a global, industrial, technologically sophisticated civilization. And they would, of course, get it wrong, profoundly wrong. They would describe modern humanity as a sparse network of small, isolated, mountain-dwelling communities, perhaps with mysterious religious practices that involved building strange structures at altitude. That thought experiment is not perfectly applicable to the deep past, but it is closer to the truth than is usually acknowledged. The bias of the surviving record is real, and its implications are sobering. Whatever was happening on the lost coasts of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, the archaeology built from inland survivals can only see a small fraction of it. The rest has been edited out by water, not by intent but by the simple physics of melting ice. What complicates the matter further is that the rise was not uniform. There were periods of acceleration, sometimes startling ones. Around 14,600 years before the present, an event known as Meltwater Pulse 1a appears to have raised global sea levels by something like 14 to 18 meters within a few centuries, perhaps within as little as 350 years. That pulse alone, depending on the local geometry of the coast, could have transformed shorelines on a scale that would have been visible within a single lifetime. Communities living on flat coastal plains during such an interval would have watched the sea advance not in geological slow motion, but in the lived time of their own children and grandchildren. Villages that elders remembered as inland would have become beachfront and then submerged within the span of 3 or 4 generations, and there was almost certainly more than one such pulse. The melting of the ice sheets was uneven, punctuated by collapses of particular ice domes and sudden drainings of glacial lakes. The breach of Lake Agassiz in North America, the destabilization of marine-based ice in the Antarctic, the periodic disintegration of continental ice margins. Each of these events sent its own surge of water into the oceans, raising the global sea level in steps that, while invisible on a smoothed graph, would have been deeply visible on the ground. To those who lived through them, the sea did not rise gradually. It rose, paused, rose again, paused longer, then rose suddenly when no one was expecting it. That kind of irregular catastrophe is exactly the sort of thing that lodges itself in oral tradition, even as the dates and details slowly distort. This is, in the end, the geological backdrop against which any honest discussion of Atlantis must be staged. Not a single event, not a single sinking, but a long, uneven, partially remembered process by which the world's preferred human habitats, its lowlands, its shores, its great river plains, were progressively erased by water. Some of that erasure happened slowly enough to be adapted to. Some of it happened quickly enough to traumatize. And in between, there is a wide grey zone of places that were lost without anyone left to mourn them properly, lost into a silence that no later civilization could fully decode. What surfaces instead of the lost coast themselves is the persistent shape of their absence, a shape that the next generations would dress in the language they had, the language of gods, of punishments of vanished ages, and passed down through stories that no one quite trusted, and yet no one quite let go of either. What rises from these drowned generations is not a coherent record, but a strange chorus, scattered across continents and millennia, repeating itself in languages that never met. It is one of the most unsettling patterns in the entire study of comparative mythology, and it has been noticed for a very long time. Wherever human beings settled near water, and human beings have almost always settled near water, they eventually told the same kind of story: a great flood, a righteous survivor, a vessel of some sort, often hastily built, often divinely instructed, a handful of lives preserved while the rest of the world dissolves. And then, after the waters recede, a new beginning, marked sometimes by a covenant, sometimes by a sacrifice, sometimes by a quiet sense that what came before will never quite return. The oldest written versions of this story emerge from Mesopotamia on clay tablets that predate the Hebrew Bible by more than 1,000 years. The Sumerian Eridu Genesis tells of a king named Ziusudra, warned by the god Enki to build a great boat before the gods send a deluge to wipe out humanity. The later Babylonian tradition gives a similar warning to a man named Atrahasis, and later still, the Epic of Gilgamesh preserves the most famous version of all, in which Utnapishtim, granted immortality after surviving the flood, recounts to the wandering hero how he loaded his ship with seed and animals, sealed it with bitumen, and rode out a storm so fierce that even the gods were terrified by what they had unleashed. The parallels with the much later story of Noah are not subtle. The shape of the vessel, the gathering of animals, the sending out of birds to test for dry land. These elements are not common imaginative inventions reappearing by chance. They are the surviving features of a tradition that travelled, that was copied, that was retold across cultures over the course of millennia. What is harder to explain is why the same basic pattern appears in places where direct cultural contact is implausible. In the Greek world, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a flood sent by Zeus, repopulating the earth by casting stones behind them. In the Indian tradition, Manu is warned by a fish, sometimes identified with an avatar of Vishnu, to prepare a boat. In Mesoamerican accounts, including those preserved in the Popol Vuh of the Quiché Maya, earlier ages of humanity are destroyed by water before the present world is established. Among the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, stories of great waves that drowned the coast and killed entire villages have, in recent decades, been correlated with geological evidence of a massive Cascadia subduction zone earthquake and tsunami in January 1700, an event reconstructed not only from local oral traditions, but also from Japanese tide records of an unexplained orphan tsunami that struck without a felt earthquake. The story turned out to be a record. The geologists, in this case, learned something they did not previously know by listening to what had once been dismissed as folklore. The Cascadia case is worth pausing on, because it demonstrates something that the broader debate over flood myths often loses sight of. Oral tradition can preserve real environmental events with surprising fidelity, sometimes across many generations, when the events are sufficiently severe and the cultural transmission is sufficiently disciplined. Researchers working with Australian Aboriginal communities have documented stories that appear to encode the flooding of the Bassian Land Bridge between Tasmania and the mainland, an event that occurred at the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago. The stories describe specific landmarks, specific journeys across what is now seabed, specific places where the water rose. If these traditions are accepted as genuine memory rather than coincidental narrative, they would represent the longest continuous oral record of any historical event in the human archive. They would also imply that, under the right conditions, human memory can carry information across spans of time that the modern mind tends to dismiss as impossible. This shifts the question of flood myths considerably. The older skeptical view treated them as theological fiction, useful for explaining seasonal river floods and occasional storm surges, but otherwise empty of historical content. The newer, more cautious view does not insist that every flood story is a literal record. It simply notes that some of them might be, that the discipline does not yet have a good way to tell which is which, and that the convergence of pattern across so many unrelated cultures is itself a kind of data. Either humanity has, for reasons that are themselves interesting, an inexplicable obsession with imagining floods, or humanity has, in fact, lived through enough catastrophic water events that the memory of them became one of the few stories worth preserving across every break in continuity? The honest answer is probably some combination of both, layered in ways that cannot easily be separated. Floods are common. Coastal communities are particularly vulnerable to them. Any civilization that lasts long enough will eventually experience at least one event severe enough to scar its imagination. And once such an event enters oral tradition, it tends to merge with other floods, with other catastrophes, with the moral concerns of the storytellers who carry it forward, until what survives is no longer a single event but a composite. The flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh may have begun as a memory of a real Mesopotamian inundation, perhaps the catastrophic flooding of the Shuruppak region around 2900 before the Common Era, for which there is sedimentary evidence. But by the time it reached the form preserved on the tablets, it had already been compressed, moralized, theologized, and combined with other elements into something larger than any single event could have been. What makes the pattern compelling, even after all these caveats, is that it persists. It persists across cultures that had no contact. It persists in regions that have never experienced a single catastrophic flood in recorded history. It persists in the highlands and the deserts as readily as it persists along the coasts. There is something in the human mind that wants this story, that finds it useful, that returns to it again and again as if to a wound that will not close. And whether that something is rooted in shared real experience, in shared cognitive structure, or in some mixture of both, the persistence itself is part of what keeps the question of Atlantis alive. Plato's tale is not in the end a stranger in this chorus. It is one voice among many, distinguished mainly by its specificity, its philosophical framing, and its particular insistence that the destruction was sudden, total, and remembered by priests in a foreign land. What separates the Atlantis story from 1,000 other deluge accounts is not its plot. The plot is, in many ways, conventional. What separates it is the claim that the destruction took with it not just a generation, not just a city, but an entire civilization that had reached a level of organization and ambition the speakers of the story considered worth describing in detail. That is the part the other flood myths do not usually emphasize. They mourn the death of people. They rarely mourn the death of a sophisticated political order. The fact that Plato's account does mourn precisely that, and does so in language that suggests the loss is genuinely felt, is one of the reasons it has refused to be quietly absorbed into the general background of comparative mythology. It insists, somehow, on standing apart. And the question of whether it has any right to that distinction remains, as ever, suspended over deep water. The trouble with insisting that no civilization could have existed before the conventional starting line of recorded history is that the ground itself keeps producing inconvenient surprises. For most of the 20th century, the textbook sequence was almost reassuringly tidy. First came the slow domestication of plants and animals somewhere around 10,000 years before the Common Era. Then came small permanent villages, then the first towns, then the first temples, then the first cities, then the first writing, then the recognizable beginnings of what most people are willing to call civilization. The order was neat, it was logical, it made sense to anyone who assumed that monumental architecture required surplus food, and surplus food required agriculture, and agriculture required settled life, and settled life required forgetting the older nomadic patterns of hunting and gathering. Each step seemed to demand the previous one, and the whole chain stretched comfortably across a few thousand years of development. Until one site, on a windswept ridge in southeastern Turkey, quietly broke it. Göbekli Tepe is not a name that rolls easily off the tongue, and for decades it sat unexcavated under the gaze of farmers and the occasional puzzled archaeological survey. The hill itself looked unremarkable, a low rise with scattered limestone fragments visible at the surface. A 1963 survey by Istanbul University and the University of Chicago noted the stones, but interpreted them as remnants of a medieval Byzantine cemetery. The site was not seriously revisited until the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived in 1994 looking for early Neolithic remains in the region. What he found once excavation began the following year was not a cemetery. It was something that the existing chronological framework was not built to accommodate. The earliest layers at Göbekli Tepe have been radiocarbon dated to approximately 9,600 before the Common Era, with construction continuing for roughly 2 millennia after that. This places the site firmly within the pre-pottery Neolithic A phase when, according to every standard model, human beings in the region were still primarily hunter-gatherers, organised in small mobile bands with no agriculture, no permanent settlements of any significant size, no metallurgy, and no apparent capacity for the kind of organised labour that monumental architecture requires. And yet the people who built Göbekli Tepe quarried massive limestone pillars, some of them weighing between 10 and 20 tons, shaped them into T-shaped monoliths, carved them with sophisticated reliefs of foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, wild boars and other creatures, transported them across difficult terrain and arranged them in carefully designed circular enclosures, some of which contained pillars over 5 meters tall. Then, after using the structures for a few centuries, they deliberately and methodically buried them. It is the deliberate burial that may be the strangest part of all. Most ancient sites are abandoned, eroded, or destroyed by later peoples. Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned in the ordinary sense. The enclosures were filled in, layer by layer, with debris that appears to have been intentionally deposited, sealing the older structures beneath new ones. The act suggests that the builders themselves were closing the site in some ritual sense, performing a final gesture whose meaning is now lost. Whatever Göbekli Tepe was, its makers knew when they were finished with it, and they treated its ending with care. That alone places it in a different category from the casual decay of most archaeological remains. The implications, once they're absorbed, are disorienting. Either hunter-gatherer societies in the late Pleistocene and early Holocene were capable of organising labour on a scale that the conventional model said was impossible without agriculture, or there is something missing from the standard picture of how those societies functioned. Klaus Schmidt himself proposed a radical reversal of the usual sequence. Perhaps, he suggested, it was not agriculture that produced the temple, but the temple that produced agriculture. Perhaps the desire to gather large numbers of people in one place for ritual purposes, the need to feed them, the necessity of organising the logistics of construction, drove the early experiments with cultivating wild grains. Perhaps civilization began not with the field but with the sanctuary. The hypothesis is contested, but its mere plausibility represents a significant inversion of the inherited model. What the site does beyond all the technical debates is collapse the assumption that the late Ice Age and the very early Holocene were periods of cultural simplicity. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not naive. The carvings on the pillars are not crude. They are stylized, confident, and in some cases narratively complex, suggesting symbolic systems that the later inhabitants of the region either inherited in modified form or, more troublingly, lost entirely. There are pillars at Göbekli Tepe that researchers have interpreted as anthropomorphic, with arms and hands carved in low relief along their sides, as if the stones themselves were meant to represent some kind of being, perhaps an ancestor, perhaps a deity, perhaps something else for which the modern vocabulary has no equivalent. The famous Pillar 43, sometimes called the Vulture Stone, has been the subject of intense speculation, with one paper proposing that its carvings might encode an astronomical record of a comet impact around the time of the Younger Dryas. Mainstream archaeologists have largely rejected that specific interpretation, but the very fact that such a reading is even debatable indicates how much information the carvings might be carrying that has not yet been deciphered. Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Other sites in the region, Karahan Tepe, Navali Kori, Kayonu, share aspects of the same culture, suggesting that the site is not an anomaly but a representative example of a broader phenomenon. There was, in southeastern Anatolia, at the threshold of the Holocene, something happening that does not fit comfortably into the older narrative. Whether it constitutes a forgotten civilization in the full Atlantean sense, with maritime power and concentric harbours, is another matter. It almost certainly does not. But it constitutes something, capacity, a complexity, an organisational reach that previous models had not anticipated. And it raises, with quiet force, the question of how many other such sites might exist, undiscovered beneath later soil layers or rising seas, awaiting their own accidental excavation. There is a particular kind of vertigo that follows the realization that the chronological order of human achievement may not be as fixed as it once seemed. If a sophisticated ritual landscape could exist nearly 12,000 years ago in a region that, by every prior account, was inhabited only by mobile foraging bands, then what does that imply about the limits of what foraging societies could accomplish? And if those limits were higher than previously believed, what becomes of the confident dismissal of every traditional account that speaks of organized communities, ritual centers, and lost knowledge from periods that the textbooks had labeled too primitive for such things? Göbekli Tepe does not solve the problem of Atlantis. It has nothing to say about Plato directly, nothing about sunken islands beyond the Pillars of Heracles, nothing about 10 kings and orichalcum walls. But it does something more subtle. It removes a piece of the wall that had been keeping the question contained, the wall that said human beings simply could not have done such things at such early dates, and therefore any tradition that suggested they could must be invention. That wall is no longer entirely intact. There is a gap in it now, on a hill in Turkey, where stones that should not have been carved at all stand silent, half buried, waiting to be questioned again by a discipline that is still learning how to ask. Once a wall in the inherited model develops a crack, the imagination begins searching for the next place where the masonry might be giving way. Sometimes the search is disciplined, attentive to evidence, willing to be disappointed. Sometimes it is impatient, and reaches for whatever pattern looks most satisfying from a distance. The two impulses are rarely cleanly separable, and nowhere has their entanglement been more visible than in the long, strange history of human attention paid to a circular formation in the Western Sahara, in the Adrar region of Mauritania, that resembles from above an enormous eye staring up from the desert floor. The Richet structure was unknown to the wider world until the era of orbital photography. From the ground, it is barely visible as a feature at all. The traveller crossing the Sahara on foot or by camel would experience it as an unremarkable sequence of low ridges and shallow basins, distinguishable from the surrounding desert only by a slight change in the colour of the rock and the curious circularity of certain horizons. It was not until the early space missions of the 1960s that astronauts, looking down from low Earth orbit, began to notice it. From above, the structure resolves into a series of nearly perfect concentric rings, roughly 40 kilometres across, with bands of differently coloured rock alternating in a pattern so geometric that the first impression is unavoidable. It looks designed. The temptation, once the resemblance to Plato's description has been noticed, is almost irresistible. Concentric rings of land alternating with what could be read as channels, a vast plain stretching away from the central feature, a location in northwestern Africa broadly consistent with a position beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, which the Greeks identified as the Pillars of Heracles, a landscape that, during the African humid period between roughly 14,500 and 5,500 years before the present, was not the parched desert it is today, but a green expanse of lakes, rivers, savannas, and seasonal wetlands. The pieces, arranged in a certain way, seem to fit. And so, beginning in the early 21st century, a quiet but persistent claim has circulated in alternative archaeology circles. The Eye of the Sahara, the argument goes, is the lost city of Atlantis, hiding in plain sight, visible only from the perspective that ancient peoples could not have possessed. The argument has a certain elegance. It explains, at least superficially, why no one located Atlantis for so long. The relevant region is now landlocked, the relevant pattern is invisible from ground level, and the relevant landscape has been transformed by climate change so severe that its earlier character is barely recognizable. It also accounts for the rough scale that Plato described. The diameter of the Richat structure is in the same general range as the dimensions given for Atlantis in the Critias, although the comparison requires some flexibility about which measurements are being matched. To readers already inclined to believe that the conventional account of prehistory is missing something important, the fit feels meaningful. To geologists, however, the fit is a coincidence of shape, and a coincidence that the rocks themselves emphatically refuse to support. The mainstream geological interpretation of the Richat structure is not mysterious. It is the eroded remnant of a deeply uplifted dome of ancient sedimentary rock, intruded by various igneous bodies over the course of geological time. The concentric rings are not channels and ridges in any architectural sense. They are differential erosion patterns produced by the variable hardness of the rock layers exposed when the overlying material was stripped away by wind and occasional water over millions of years. The harder layers stand as ridges. The softer layers form valleys between them. The result is a topography that, viewed from above, presents a striking circular pattern, but which, examined on the ground, is unmistakably a feature of geology rather than construction. There are no quarried stones, there are no foundations, there are no artifacts of the kind that would accompany even a minor settlement, let alone a major civilization. The basement rocks involved are hundreds of millions of years old, far predating any human presence on the planet. Whatever the Richat structure is, it is not the architectural achievement of any people, and yet the appeal of the Atlantis identification persists, and it is worth asking why. Part of the reason is that the resemblance, when first encountered, is genuinely arresting. The mind responds to circular geometry with an immediate sense of intention, because in the ordinary human experience, almost all circular things are made. Wheels, plates, rings, arenas, town squares, sacred enclosures, circles tend to be artifacts. When the eye encounters a 40-kilometre wide arrangement of rings in the desert, the inherited intuition struggles to register it as natural, even when the geology is clear. Pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random or natural arrangements, operates at large scales as readily as at small ones. The Richat structure exploits this tendency almost perfectly. It is the geological equivalent of a face in the clouds, except that the face is the shape of a city. There is also, perhaps, a deeper psychological function at work. The desire to find Atlantis is not, in many cases, a desire for a particular set of facts. It is a desire for confirmation that the ancient world contained more than has been preserved, that something genuinely lost lies within reach of recovery, that the textbook version of prehistory is not the final word. The Richat structure offers, however briefly, the feeling of that confirmation. It satisfies the wish without requiring the harder work of evaluating the evidence. And once the wish has been satisfied, even temporarily, it becomes difficult to relinquish. Skeptical analysis feels, to those who have invested in the identification, less like clarification and more like deprivation. What the Richat structure does illustrate, despite itself, is a real and important point about the deep past of the Sahara. The desert was not always a desert. During the African humid period, monsoon rains penetrated far further north than they do today, sustaining lakes whose former shorelines can still be traced in the satellite imagery of regions that are now bone dry. Megalake Chad, for instance, once covered an area of approximately 350,000 square kilometres, larger than the modern Caspian Sea, and its basin retains the geological signatures of that vanished water body. Rock art from the Tassili Niger Plateau in Algeria depicts hippopotamuses, giraffes, and herds of cattle in landscapes where none of these animals could survive today. Human populations lived in places that are now uninhabitable, fishing in lakes that have left only their dried sediments behind. The end of this humid period, around 5,500 years before the present, drove a wave of human migration toward the still-watered Nile Valley, contributing in some scholarly accounts to the conditions that made early Egyptian civilization possible. This is the genuine lost world of the Sahara, not as concentric rings beneath the desert sands, but as ecological memory, written in the bones of fish and the brushstrokes of forgotten artists. It is a story less geometrically satisfying than the Atlantis identification, but considerably better supported by the evidence. And it raises its own quiet question, which the satellite image of the Richat structure can never quite answer. If a green Sahara could be forgotten, with all its lakes and herds and human villages, in only a few thousand years, what else, in regions whose transformations were even more thorough, has slipped beyond the edge of what anyone now remembers? The question of what has slipped beyond memory takes a different shape when the search moves north, away from the deserts and into the cold grey waters of the North Sea. There, beneath the modern shipping lanes and oil platforms, beneath the trawler nets that occasionally bring up something they were not designed to catch, lies a landscape that no living human eye has ever seen above the waves. It has a name, given to it relatively recently by the researchers who have spent the last several decades reconstructing it from sonar surveys, sediment cores, and the slow accumulation of accidental finds. The name is Doggerland, and it is one of the clearest cases on record of a real, substantial, populated region that vanished beneath the sea within the span of human memory. During the last glacial maximum, when sea level stood roughly 120 metres lower than today, the entire basin of the modern North Sea was dry land. It was not a barren tundra, although portions of it certainly were during the coldest phases. As the climate warmed and the great ice sheets retreated, Doggerland became a rich, varied environment of rivers, lakes, marshes and woodlands, populated by red deer, aurochs, wild boar, and the human communities that hunted them. It connected the British Isles to the European mainland, forming a single continuous territory across which Mesolithic peoples moved freely. The evidence of their presence is preserved in worked flint tools, harpoon points carved from antler, and the occasional human bone, all dragged up over the years by fishermen who initially had no idea what they were holding. One particularly famous find, made in 1931 by the trawler Kalinda, was a barbed antler point dated to roughly 12,000 years before the present, embedded in a chunk of peat. The peat itself proved that the seabed where the artifact had come up was once dry land, and dry land long enough ago that someone had stood on it, hunted on it, and left a tool there. Decades of subsequent research, particularly by teams at the University of Bradford and other institutions involved in the North Sea Paleolandscapes project, have transformed what was once a vague impression into a detailed reconstruction. Using seismic data originally collected for oil exploration, researchers have mapped the courses of buried river systems, the outlines of vanished coastlines, and the general topography of a territory that may have covered an area comparable to the modern United Kingdom at its maximum extent. There were hills, valleys, estuaries, and large freshwater lakes. There were places where the rivers Thames and Rhine joined together before continuing northward across the now submerged plain. There were almost certainly communities living along those rivers, drawn by the same combination of fresh water, fish, and game that has attracted human settlement throughout history. What happened to Doggerland is not, in its broad outlines, mysterious. The same long process that drowned coastlines all over the post-glacial world drowned this one. Sea levels continued to rise as the remaining ice sheets melted, the territory shrank, and the higher ground became a series of islands, then smaller islands, then almost nothing at all. By approximately 6,200 before the Common Era, what remained of Doggerland was reduced to the area now known as Dogger Bank, a shallow region in the middle of the North Sea that is still, even today, recognisable as an underwater plateau. And around that same time, an additional event appears to have completed the destruction. Off the coast of what is now Norway, an enormous submarine landslide on the Storegga slope released a tsunami that swept across the North Sea, striking the remaining low-lying lands of Doggerland with a wave estimated to have been at least several metres high in some places. The geological evidence for this tsunami is unambiguous. Sediment layers along the eastern coast of Scotland, the Shetland Islands, and the coast of Norway preserve the distinctive signature of marine deposition occurring suddenly and over wide areas. Whether this event delivered the final blow to a territory that was already shrinking, or whether it merely accelerated a process that would have completed itself anyway, the result was the same. By the time the waters had settled, Doggerland was gone. The reason the Doggerland case matters so much in the broader Atlantis discussion is that it cannot be dismissed. It is not a fringe theory. It is not a misreading of geology. It is a documented prehistoric landscape, populated by real human beings that drowned beneath rising seas in a series of events that human memory may well have witnessed. If a story were preserved among the descendants of those communities about a great land their ancestors had once inhabited, a land taken by water, a land that no longer existed, that story would be true. It would be a record, however distorted by retelling of an actual event. And the people who told it would not be inventing anything. They would be remembering. This raises a question that is difficult to suppress. If Doggerland existed and is now confirmed, how many similar territories existed in other parts of the world, drowned by the same rising seas, populated by communities whose memories may or may not have survived in any recognisable form? The Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, as already noted, was a far larger landmass than Doggerland, and would have been an even more attractive habitat during the late Pleistocene. Its drowning is geologically certain. Its archaeology, because of the extreme difficulty of underwater excavation in tropical seas, is barely begun. The Persian Gulf basin, before sea levels rose, was a fertile valley watered by the Tigris, the Euphrates, and at least two other major river systems whose dried beds are still visible in radar imagery. Some researchers have proposed that this valley was a significant centre of human population during the late glacial period, and that its inundation may be reflected in the recurring Mesopotamian motif of an antediluvian world from which civilization emerged. The proposal remains controversial, but it is not absurd, and it is supported by exactly the kind of geological evidence that, in the case of Doggerland, has now become standard. What the existence of Doggerland does, in the end, is shift the burden of proof in a subtle but important way. The sceptical position, for most of the 20th century, was that any account of a substantial inhabited region drowned in the deep past was inherently improbable, because the planet did not contain such regions. The sceptical position can no longer be quite so confident. The planet did contain such regions. At least one of them is now mapped in detail. Others almost certainly existed, in places where mapping has not yet caught up. And the question is no longer whether ancient civilizations could have lost territories to rising seas, because at least some communities demonstrably did. The question is what those losses look like from the inside, and what, if anything, of their texture survives in the stories that later generations told and retold and gradually stopped quite believing. The waters of the North Sea today are dark and busy. Tankers cross them, fishing fleets work them, oil rigs dot their horizon. Beneath all of this traffic, the rivers of a vanished world still trace their old courses through the buried sediment, and somewhere in these sediments, the bones of people who once stood beside them remain. What lies beneath the North Sea is, in a sense, the easier case. It is a landscape, not a city. Its loss is the loss of villages, hunting grounds, river valleys. the dispersed traces of small mobile communities whose absence is poignant precisely because it is so quiet. There is no expectation that one will find streets, walls, or temples beneath a Dogger bank. The rising water in that case simply erased the conditions under which human life had been possible, and the people moved on to whatever higher ground was still available. The drowning of Doggerland fits comfortably within the conventional understanding of how prehistoric populations responded to environmental change. It does not in itself suggest that anything more elaborate has been lost. It is when the seabed begins to yield evidence of streets that the conversation becomes more difficult to contain. Off the southern coast of the Peloponnese, in shallow water near the village of Pavlopetri in Laconia, there is a Bronze Age town. Not a fragmentary scatter of stones, not a few suggestive blocks that might be interpreted as architecture, but a planned settlement with identifiable streets, courtyards, building foundations, and what appear to be tombs, all preserved in roughly 3 to 4 meters of clear water just offshore. It was first noticed in 1904 by a geologist named Fulcian Negris, who recorded the presence of submerged structures but did not pursue the discovery. It was rediscovered in 1967 by a British team led by Nicholas Fleming, and surveyed in detail in 1968 by a Cambridge expedition that mapped the visible remains. More recent work, particularly the underwater survey conducted between 2009 and 2013 by a joint Greek-British team using sophisticated three-dimensional mapping techniques, has revealed that Pavlopetri is older and more extensive than originally believed. The earliest occupation appears to date to approximately 3,500 before the Common Era, with the settlement reaching its developed form during the Mycenaean period, and continuing in use until around 1100 before the Common Era, when it was apparently abandoned. The cause of its inundation is most likely a combination of gradual subsidence and the effects of one or more earthquakes, which the seismically active Aegean has produced regularly throughout its history. Pavlopetri matters because it forces a recalibration of what is plausible. It is, by any reasonable definition, a sunken city. Not a single building, not a fortified outpost, but an organised urban settlement with a clearly visible street plan, occupying a position that, when it was inhabited, was on dry land near the coast. It has been documented, photographed, and studied. Its existence is not disputed, and it raises with discomforting clarity the question of how many other such sites exist along the world's coastlines, particularly in regions where seismic activity, subsidence, and post-glacial sea level rise have combined to relocate the shoreline relative to ancient settlements. The answer increasingly appears to be more than was once supposed. In 1984, an Israeli archaeologist named Ehud Galili, while diving off the coast at Atlit, south of Haifa, came across a series of structures lying on the seabed in roughly 10 meters of water. Subsequent excavation revealed a pre-pottery Neolithic village dating to approximately 7,000 before the Common Era, now known as Atlit-Yam. The site is extraordinary not only for its antiquity, but for the conditions of its preservation. The settlement was buried rapidly enough by sediment that organic materials, including wooden posts, plant remains, and human skeletons, have survived to a degree that is almost unheard of for a site of this age. The excavators have recovered evidence of a community that practiced agriculture, kept domesticated animals, fished, and built rectangular stone houses with carefully constructed walls. They have also recovered a stone semicircle of 7 monoliths, weighing up to 600 kilograms each, arranged around what appears to be a freshwater spring. The function of this arrangement is unknown, but its deliberateness is unmistakable. Someone 9,000 years ago decided that this particular spring deserved a stone monument and organised the labour to construct one. Even more poignantly, the site has yielded the skeletons of a woman and child showing the earliest known evidence of tuberculosis transmitted from cattle, suggesting that the village was already participating in the kinds of close human-animal interactions that would later transform global disease ecology. Whatever Atlit-Yam was, it was not the dwelling of a marginal or transient population. It was a stable, organised community with houses, monuments, livestock, and the unfortunate health consequences of agricultural life. And it now lies beneath the eastern Mediterranean, drowned not by a single dramatic event, but most likely by the same gradual sea level rise that has been reshaping coastlines throughout the Holocene. These are not the only examples. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Cambay near the modern city of Surat, a series of underwater anomalies discovered during pollution surveys in the early 2000s have been the subject of intense and largely unresolved debate. Some Indian researchers have claimed that the anomalies represent the remains of an extensive submerged urban complex, possibly dating to before the Indus Valley civilization. Mainstream archaeologists have generally been more cautious, noting that the artifacts recovered have been few, the dating methods have been controversial, and the structures themselves have not been confirmed by direct visual inspection at the standards normally required for archaeological identification. The Gulf of Cambay claims may turn out to be overstated. They may also turn out to be partially correct. The point is not that they have been settled, but that the question is now sufficiently legitimate that respectable institutions are willing to engage with it. In the Black Sea, William Ryan and Walter Pittman of the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory proposed in 1997 that the basin had been a freshwater lake at the end of the last ice age, surrounded by populated lowlands, and that around 5,600 before the Common Era, the rising Mediterranean had broken through the Bosporus, flooding the basin catastrophically and forcing the populations who lived along its shores to disperse. The hypothesis has been challenged on the question of how rapid and how catastrophic the inundation actually was, with some studies suggesting a more gradual filling than the original model proposed. But the underlying observations, that the Black Sea coast preserves submerged landscapes that were once inhabited, has been repeatedly confirmed by subsequent marine archaeology. There are wrecks down there of remarkable preservation. There are also, almost certainly, settlements. What all of this evidence accumulates into is not a single Atlantis, gleaming in concentric harbours at some specific identifiable location, but something perhaps more troubling. It is the recognition that the world's continental shelves, where they were exposed during the lower sea levels of the late Pleistocene, were inhabited. That when the seas rose, the inhabitants did not simply walk away in tidy migrations. Some of them watched their homes, their fields, their sacred places, and their dead disappear beneath the waves over the course of generations. Some of them undoubtedly told stories about it. And those stories, refracted through the long centuries that followed, may have entered the great chorus of flood myths and lost city traditions that the inheriting cultures could no longer quite locate on any map. The streets of Pavlopetri are still there, beneath the clear water of Vatica Bay. They are walked now only by divers and by the occasional curious fish, but they are streets, and they were once meant to be walked, and the people who walked them are not coming back. The streets of Pavlopetri are documented, photographed, and reasonably well understood. They no longer carry the burden of mystery, only the quieter burden of absence. But there is a different kind of evidence, one that does not lie on the seabed and cannot be photographed in clear shallow water, that has occupied the imagination of those who pursue lost civilizations with at least as much persistence. It is the evidence of old maps, drawn in eras when the boundaries of the known world were still in flux, and which appear, to certain readers, to depict things that their makers should not have been able to know. The most famous of these, by a considerable margin, is the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer of the same name, who compiled it from a collection of earlier sources. Only a fragment of the original survives, preserved in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, where it was rediscovered in 1929 during the cataloguing of the palace archives. The fragment depicts the Atlantic Ocean and its surrounding coastlines, including portions of Europe, Africa, and the eastern shores of the Americas, with a level of detail that, for a map of that period, is genuinely impressive. Piri Reis himself notes in marginal inscriptions that he drew on roughly 20 source maps, including some that he describes as ancient, and at least one that he attributes to information derived from Christopher Columbus, whose voyages were then only 2 decades in the past. What has made the Piri Reis map a fixture of alternative history is a particular feature of its southern portion. The lower section of the surviving fragment shows a landmass that some interpreters have argued represents the coast of Antarctica, drawn as it would appear without its modern ice sheet. The claim, popularised in the mid-20th century by Charles Hapgood, a history professor at Keene State College in New Hampshire, was that the Piri Reis map preserved cartographic information from a much older source as to be seen, possibly thousands of years older, when Antarctica had been ice-free and accessible to whoever had originally surveyed it. Hapgood elaborated this claim in his book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, published in 1966, and proposed that an unknown maritime civilization, technologically sophisticated and capable of long-distance navigation, had mapped the Earth before the end of the last ice age, and that fragments of their work had survived in copies and recopies across the millennia, eventually reaching cartographers like Piri Reis in distorted form. The hypothesis is, on its face, breathtaking. It would, if correct, require almost everything in the conventional history of cartography to be substantially revised. It would require an ice-free Antarctica, accessible to human observers, which the geological record places far earlier than any currently accepted human presence on the continent. It would require an unknown civilization capable of extensive maritime survey, of producing accurate cartographic representations across hemispheres, and of preserving its work through countless cycles of copying. And it would require all of this to have been accomplished without leaving any other trace recognizable to mainstream archaeology. The mainstream response has been correspondingly skeptical. Most cartographic historians who've examined the Piri Reis map in detail have concluded that the southern landmass, if it is meant to represent any real coastline at all, is most likely a distorted depiction of the southern coast of South America, drawn with a limited geographical knowledge of the early 16th century. The apparent resemblance to the actual subglacial topography of Antarctica is, according to this analysis, a coincidence produced by the natural tendency of the human eye to find correspondence in ambiguous shapes. The argument, when stated this way, sounds settled. It is not quite. The mainstream interpretation is the more parsimonious one, and it should be preferred under ordinary epistemic principles. But the Piri Reis map remains, even after all the criticism, a curious document. The detail of its African coastline is unusually accurate for its period. The relationships between certain features are difficult to explain entirely from the sources that Piri Reis acknowledges, and the map sits within a broader cartographic tradition that included other puzzling productions, such as the 1531 Arons Fine Map, and the various Mercator-derived charts of the late 16th century, some of which depict a southern continent in positions that, while not matching modern Antarctica precisely, do not fit neatly into the cartographic conventions of pure speculation either. The more disciplined version of the question raised by these maps is not whether they prove the existence of an ancient maritime civilization. They almost certainly do not. The question is what kinds of geographical knowledge were circulating in the late medieval and early modern periods, what their actual sources were, and how to distinguish between genuine cartographic transmission and the various forms of educated guessing, theological inference, and creative reconstruction that fill the unmapped portions of the world. Medieval cartography, after all, was not purely a matter of empirical observation. It was a layered tradition in which inherited authority, classical texts, sailors' reports, religious doctrine, and pure imagination were all blended together, sometimes in ways that produce startlingly accurate results. and sometimes in ways that produced phantom continents that persisted on maps for centuries despite never having existed at all. The history of cartographic phantom islands is itself a fascinating digression, and a sobering one for those inclined to take old maps too literally. The island of High Brazil, supposedly located west of Ireland, appeared on maps from at least the 14th century onward and remained a fixture of Atlantic cartography until the late 19th century, when the British Admiralty finally removed it from the official charts after repeated expeditions failed to locate it. The island of Friesland, somewhere in the North Atlantic between Iceland and Greenland, appeared on maps from the late 16th century after being introduced by the Zeno brothers, who claimed to have visited it in the 14th century. It does not exist. The island of St. Brendan, named for the wandering Irish monk whose legendary voyage in the 6th century supposedly reached it, persisted on Atlantic charts for over 1,000 years and inspired multiple expeditions, none of which found anything. The lesson of these phantom islands is not that all uncharted features on old maps are imaginary. It is that some of them are, and that distinguishing real geographical knowledge from inherited fiction is genuinely difficult, even for professional cartographic historians. What this means for any attempt to identify Atlantis on an old map is that the bar for evidence has to be set quite high. The mere appearance of a landmass in an unexpected location, on a map of uncertain provenance drawn by a cartographer, working from sources that cannot all be reconstructed, does not constitute strong evidence that the landmass actually existed. The history of cartography is full of such appearances, and most of them turn out, on closer examination, to be artifacts of the long, complicated, often unreliable process by which geographical knowledge was transmitted from one generation to another, with copying errors, theological additions, political distortions, and outright invention, all mixing together in proportions that can rarely be separated cleanly. And yet the maps remain. They sit in their archives, occasionally consulted, occasionally photographed for popular books, occasionally cited in arguments that their original makers would not have recognized. Whatever they encode something. Whether that something is the residue of a forgotten civilization, the accumulated patchwork of medieval geographical speculation, or some unstable combination of the two, the maps themselves are old enough now that they have begun, in their own way, to feel like artifacts of a world that has half forgotten how it used to think. The maps may be uncertain witnesses, but the stones are not. Stones do not lie in the sense that a map can lie. They cannot be copied incorrectly, embellished by an enthusiastic cartographer, or invented by a bored monastic scribe filling in the unknown corners of the world with imaginary islands. Stones, when they are large enough, and arranged with sufficient deliberation, simply persist, century after century, presenting a problem that any honest history of human civilization has to address. And the problem, when one looks at the global distribution of megalithic structures with even a moderately open mind, is more substantial than the textbooks generally admit. The conventional narrative of monumental construction in prehistory has, until relatively recently, proceeded along familiar lines. Megalithic architecture in this account was a regional phenomenon that emerged independently in various parts of the world after the development of agriculture, primarily as an expression of the religious and social needs of settled farming communities. The great stone monuments of Western Europe, the dolmens of Brittany, the passage tombs of Ireland, the stone circles of Britain, were attributed to local Neolithic populations who, having achieved a sufficient agricultural surplus, organised themselves into the labour formations necessary to quarry, transport and erect the relevant stones. Similar processes were assumed to account for the megalithic traditions of the Iberian Peninsula, the Mediterranean islands, the Caucasus, parts of South Asia, and the various scattered megalithic sites of Africa and the Pacific. The traditions were related to one another, when they were related at all, only through the most general parallels of human behaviour under similar conditions. This account is not entirely wrong, but it is increasingly clear that it is incomplete. Recent radiocarbon dating, particularly the comprehensive 2019 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, has produced a chronology of European megalithic construction that is difficult to reconcile with the older model of independent regional emergence. The earliest dated megalithic structures appear in northwestern France, in the region of Brittany, around 4700 before the Common Era. From there, the tradition spreads in a manner that is consistent with maritime diffusion, reaching the British Isles, Iberia, and the Western Mediterranean over the following centuries, and the Scandinavian peninsula somewhat later. The pattern of dispersal is not what one would expect if megalithic construction had emerged independently in each region. It is what one would expect if the practice had originated in a single location and spread outward by sea, carried by populations or by cultural contact along the Atlantic coastline. This implies, at minimum, that the late Neolithic peoples of Western Europe possessed maritime capabilities considerably more developed than the standard accounts have generally assumed. Coast-hugging voyages of significant length would have been required to maintain the kind of cultural transmission that the dating pattern suggests, and the construction of the largest megalithic monuments, Stonehenge, Newgrange, the Karnak alignments, the temples of Malta, would have required not only local labour, but also the kind of accumulated technical knowledge that travels with people, not with abstract ideas. Someone at some point taught someone else how to do this, and whoever the teachers were, they were operating within a network of contacts that spanned thousands of kilometres of coastline, sustained over a period of roughly 2,000 years. What makes the megalithic phenomenon particularly resistant to easy explanation is the consistency of certain features across regions that should not, by any conventional account, have been in close contact. The astronomical alignments of these structures form one of the most striking examples. Stonehenge, in southern England, is famously aligned to the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset, with additional alignments to lunar standstills and other celestial events. Newgrange, in Ireland, is aligned to the winter solstice sunrise, with a roof box positioned so that for approximately 17 minutes on the morning of the solstice, sunlight penetrates the entrance passage and illuminates the inner chamber. The Maeshowe chambered cairn in Orkney is aligned to the same winter solstice sunset. The Najdra temple in Malta is aligned to the equinoxes and the solstices in ways that have been demonstrated through multiple independent studies. The recurrence of solar alignments across these widely separated sites is not in itself surprising. The sun, after all, behaves the same way in every region. But the consistency of the architectural responses to that behaviour, the apparent shared assumption that the relationship between celestial events and built space was worth encoding in stone, suggest a common framework of thought that the available chronology of cultural transmission strains to fully explain. There is also the matter of the Mediterranean megalithic temples of Malta, which present chronological problems of their own. Sites such as Giantica on the island of Gozo have been dated to approximately 3,600 before the Common Era, predating the Great Pyramids of Egypt by roughly 1,000 years, and the construction of Stonehenge by approximately 500 years. They are, by the current archaeological consensus, among the oldest freestanding stone structures on Earth. They are also, by any measure, sophisticated. The Najdra, Hegakim and Tarxian temples display architectural refinement, including corbelled roofing, elaborate carved reliefs, and what appear to be acoustic effects produced by the careful shaping of internal chambers. The civilization that built them flourished for approximately 1,000 years, and then, sometime around 2500 before the Common Era, it disappeared. The cause of its disappearance has never been satisfactorily explained. The site of Tarxian shows evidence of being abandoned and subsequently used for cremation burials, by what appears to be a culturally distinct population, suggesting that the original temple builders either died out, departed, or were displaced by newcomers who did not share their architectural traditions. The Maltese case is, in miniature, the kind of case that the Atlantis question has always implicitly raised. A relatively sophisticated culture, occupying a defined territory, producing distinctive monumental architecture and then vanishing, leaving behind only the stones, the silent evidence of what was once apparently a coherent religious and social system. The cause does not have to be a great flood. It can be drought, disease, internal conflict, external invasion, or some combination of factors that the archaeological record cannot resolve at this distance. But the pattern of disappearance, the gap between what the stones imply and what the surviving record actually preserves, is the recurring shape of the problem. What does it mean, finally, that the megalithic tradition extends as widely as it does, persists as long as it does, and disappears as completely as it does in many of the places where it once flourished? It does not mean, as some have suggested, that there must have been a single global civilization underlying all of these phenomena. The variations are too great, the local specificities too pronounced, the chronological gaps between regions too substantial to support such a unified theory. But it does mean that something happened during the period roughly between 5000 and 2000, before the Common Era, across an enormous geographical range, that involved the systematic construction of stone monuments by populations whose maritime contacts were more extensive, whose astronomical knowledge was more developed, and whose organizational capacity was more sophisticated than the older models have allowed. Whatever it was, it has not been entirely accounted for. The stones are still standing, the people who raised them are not, and the silence between what they left and what their descendants remembered is, in its own way, as eloquent as anything Plato wrote. The silence between the stones and the memory is the territory in which one of the most contested questions in historical research has quietly grown louder over the past 2 decades. The question is whether human oral tradition, transmitted entirely without writing, can preserve specific information about real environmental events across spans of time that the conventional understanding of memory considers impossible. For most of the 20th century, the answer was assumed to be obvious. Oral tradition was understood to drift, to elaborate, to absorb new material and shed old material in proportion to the cultural needs of each generation. Specific historical content in this view would survive perhaps 3 or 4 generations before being either lost or transformed into something unrecognizable. Anything beyond that horizon was assumed to be myth in the dismissive sense of the word, a story whose original reference, if there were any, had long since been replaced by the symbolic concerns of the storytellers. The challenge to this assumption has come, perhaps unexpectedly, from Australia. The continent's Aboriginal peoples have maintained in some cases oral traditions whose specificity and stability have begun to attract serious linguistic and geographical analysis. A 2015 study published in the journal Australian Geographer, conducted by Patrick Nunn of the University of the Sunshine Coast and Nicholas Reed of the University of New England, examined a body of Aboriginal stories from 21 different coastal locations around Australia, all of which describe a time when the sea level was lower and the coastline extended further out, and which name specific features that are now submerged. In some cases, the stories describe islands that were once peninsulas, channels that were once dry, and landmarks that the speaker's ancestors had known on what is now seabed. The geological evidence for sea level rise during the post-glacial period is unambiguous and well dated. When Nunn and Reed compared the Aboriginal accounts with the reconstructed coastal histories, they found that the stories appear to describe coastal configurations that had not existed for at least 7,000 years, and in some cases for as long as 10 or 11,000 years. The implications, if the analysis is correct, are profound. They suggest that under conditions of strict cultural transmission, with deliberate mechanisms for preserving accuracy across generations, oral tradition can carry specific environmental information across spans of time that exceed the conventional limits by an order of magnitude. The Aboriginal traditions in question are not simply general stories about a flooded past. They include the names of specific places, the relative position of features, and the kinds of details that would normally be expected to drift or vanish within a few centuries. The persistence of this material, if it is genuinely a persistence and not a coincidental reconstruction, indicates that human memory, properly maintained, is more robust than the standard models have allowed. The case is not closed. Some critics have suggested that the apparent correspondence between the stories and the geological reconstructions could be partly the result of more recent reinterpretations, in which the older traditions have been informed by contemporary scientific knowledge and adapted to fit. The cultural continuity required to sustain such transmission across 10,000 years would also require an extraordinary stability of population and language, which is not typical of most human societies, and the absence of comparable cases from other continents where similar coastal drowning events occurred raises questions about why the Australian traditions, if they are genuine, are apparently unique. The mainstream response has been cautious, willing to grant that Aboriginal oral tradition may indeed preserve some genuinely ancient environmental memory, but unwilling to commit to the strongest version of the claim without further corroboration. What the Australian case does, regardless of where one stands on the specifics, is reopen a question that the older skepticism had treated as closed. If there is even a possibility that some oral traditions can preserve real information about real events across spans of 7,000 to 10,000 years, then the dismissal of all such traditions as fictional becomes considerably harder to justify. And the implications for the broader pattern of flood myths, lost city accounts, and traditions of vanished ages become more interesting. It is not necessary to claim that every such tradition encodes a real event. It is only necessary to acknowledge that some of them might, and that the project of distinguishing the historically meaningful from the purely symbolic is more delicate and more potentially rewarding than the older skepticism allowed. The Cascadia case, mentioned earlier in another connection, deserves to be revisited here in this light. The traditions of the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, including the Quilut, the Makah, the Ho, and the Kino, included accounts of a great wave that struck the coast in the distant past, killing entire villages and reshaping the shoreline. For decades, anthropologists had recorded these stories without entirely knowing what to do with them. They were treated, in most cases, as a kind of cultural background, possibly reflecting some real coastal hazard but not necessarily corresponding to any specific identifiable event. Then, in the 1990s, geologists working on the seismic history of the Cascadia subduction zone identified clear evidence of a massive earthquake and tsunami that had occurred along the Pacific Northwest coast at some point in the late 17th or early 18th century. The date was eventually narrowed with remarkable precision to the evening of January 26, 1700, by means of correlation with Japanese historical records of an orphan tsunami that had struck the coasts of Honshu without any felt earthquake. A tsunami that could only have been generated by a major seismic event on the opposite side of the Pacific. The indigenous oral traditions, it turned out, were not vague cultural background. They were a record. The wave that the Quilut and the Makah and the others described had actually happened on a specific date, and the accounts that had been passed down by their ancestors had preserved the memory of it across roughly 3 centuries of oral transmission, intact enough that the geological reconstruction could be partly verified by reference to the cultural record. The discovery has had a quiet but significant influence on how academic researchers approach indigenous oral traditions in general. The default assumption is no longer that such traditions are unreliable. The default assumption, increasingly, is that they may contain real historical content that the analytical methods of the discipline have not yet learned to extract. What this means, for the larger question that this account has been circling, is that the Atlantis tradition cannot be dismissed solely on the grounds that it was transmitted across too many generations to retain any historical core. The maximum demonstrated lifespan of preserved oral tradition is now considerably longer than the gap between Plato's writing and the latest plausible date for the events he described. This does not mean that Plato's account is therefore reliable as history. The chain of transmission that he describes, Egyptian priest to Solon, Solon to his descendants, Plato's family records to Plato, is itself uncertain, and the literary purposes that Plato had for the story may have shaped its specifics in ways that no amount of underlying memory could correct for. But the older confidence that the temporal gap alone was sufficient to discredit the account has weakened considerably. The gap by itself no longer rules out the possibility of preserved content. Whether content was actually preserved is a different question, and one that the available evidence does not, as yet, allow to be answered with confidence in either direction. The waters of memory, it seems, run deeper than the older surveys had charted, and what surfaces from them is rarely as clear as the surveyors had hoped. There is a question that runs underneath all the others, quieter than the geological events and older than the oral traditions, and it concerns not what was lost, but what was allowed to be remembered. Memory, even on the scale of millennia, does not survive entirely by accident. It is shaped, curated, censored, and edited by the institutions that take responsibility for transmitting it. Priesthoods preserve some material and discard other material. Imperial chronicles emphasize certain victories and pass over certain defeats. Religious authorities approve some texts as canonical and condemn others as heretical, often with consequences that include the physical destruction of the disapproved material. Scholarly traditions, even those that consider themselves rigorously empirical, develop habits of attention that direct research towards some questions and away from others. The history that any given generation inherits is not a neutral record of what happened. It is a curated selection, filtered through the interests of whoever was in a position to decide what would be passed on. This is not in itself a controversial observation. It is acknowledged in some form by every serious historian. The question that becomes more uncomfortable is what happens when the curation has been particularly thorough, when whole categories of evidence have been deliberately suppressed, when archives have been deliberately destroyed, when traditions of interpretation have been deliberately abandoned, in ways severe enough that later generations cannot easily reconstruct what was lost. The history of the Library of Alexandria is the standard reference point for this kind of loss, and it deserves to be considered with some care, because the popular image of its destruction is not quite accurate, and the actual story is, in some ways, more troubling than the popular image. The library was not destroyed in a single catastrophic event. The fire commonly attributed to Julius Caesar in 48 before the Common Era did damage some of the library's holdings, particularly the books stored at the harbour warehouses, but the main collection survived. The library continued to function for centuries afterward, with subsequent attacks and decays gradually eroding what remained. The Roman Emperor Aurelian's recapture of Alexandria in 273 of the Common Era caused further damage. The decree of the Emperor Theodosius in 391 of the Common Era, which closed pagan temples throughout the empire, included the destruction of the Serapeum, the daughter library that contained much of what remained of the original collection. By the time of the Arab conquest of Alexandria, in 642 of the Common Era, the library as an institution had effectively ceased to exist, though scattered manuscripts may have survived in private collections and ecclesiastical archives. What was lost is impossible to specify, precisely because it was lost. Estimates of the original collection range from 40,000 to 700,000 scrolls, with the truth probably lying somewhere in the lower portion of that range. Among the works that ancient sources mention as having been in the library, but which have not survived in any form, are the complete histories of Manetho, the Egyptian priest who attempted to compile a comprehensive chronology of his civilization for the Hellenistic world, and the works of Berossus, the Babylonian priest who performed a similar service for Mesopotamian history. Both of these authors are known to have drawn on temple archives that, in their own time, were already very old. The fragments that survive of their works, preserved in quotations by later writers, suggest that they had access to material going back thousands of years before their own period. What that material actually contained, and how much of it might have spoken to the kinds of questions that the Atlantis tradition raises, cannot now be known. The originals are gone, the temple archives they drew from are gone, and what remains is a few scattered citations that hint at depths no one can any longer measure. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous example, but it is not the only one, and the pattern it illustrates is more general than is sometimes recognized. The destruction of the codices of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica by the Spanish ecclesiastical authorities in the 16th century is another well-documented case. Diego de Landa, the Franciscan bishop of Yucatan, oversaw the burning of large numbers of Mayan books at Mani in July 1562, in what he himself described as a campaign against idolatry. Of the original Mayan literary corpus, only 4 codices are known to have survived, and even these are fragmentary. The accounts of pre-conquest Mesoamerican history, cosmology and astronomy that those books contained are, for the most part, irrecoverable. What remains is reconstructed from oral traditions recorded by post-conquest scribes, from inscriptions on monuments, and from the 4 surviving codices, which between them cannot represent more than a small fraction of what was once a vast body of knowledge. Whatever those Mayan books contained about the deep past of their civilization is now lost, and the loss was not the result of natural decay, but of deliberate destruction by an authority that considered the material dangerous. The pattern recurs in other contexts as well. The destruction of the Druidic oral traditions of Iron Age Britain and Gaul, suppressed by Roman authorities and never written down by their original practitioners, is another case where an entire body of knowledge passed out of recoverable memory because the institutions that maintained it were themselves destroyed. The systematic editing of early Christian scripture during the consolidation of orthodox doctrine in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era resulted in the rejection and, in some cases, the destruction of texts that had been in circulation for generations, such as the Gnostic writings rediscovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945. The Mongol destruction of the libraries of Baghdad during the sack of 1258 of the Common Era, when the city's manuscripts were reportedly thrown into the Tigris in such quantities that the river ran black with ink, eliminated an enormous body of medieval Islamic scholarship that had itself preserved earlier Greek, Persian, and Indian material no longer available elsewhere. What these cases have in common is that they were not random. They were not the gradual erosion of memory that occurs naturally over time. They were deliberate acts by institutions that had reasons, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, for wanting certain kinds of knowledge not to survive. The reasons varied. Religious orthodoxy demanded the suppression of heretical alternatives. Imperial consolidation required the elimination of traditions that competed with the official narrative. Theological purity required the destruction of pagan learning. Each case was in its own context justified by the framework of those who carried it out. And in each case, the result was the same. A category of knowledge that had once existed, and that had been considered worth preserving by those who possessed it, ceased to be available to anyone who came afterward. If this pattern of deliberate curation has operated as widely and as persistently as the historical record suggests, then the question of what might have been lost during the much longer period before the relevant cases became visible to history takes on a particular weight. There is no reason to assume that the impulse to control memory began only with literate institutions. Pre-literate societies too had elders, priests, lineage keepers, and other figures whose authority depended in part on their control over which stories were told and which were allowed to fade. What such figures may have decided to preserve, and what they may have decided to discard, across the long centuries before any writing existed at all, is a question that the surviving evidence cannot answer. But the question itself does not therefore disappear. It only sinks deeper beneath a layer of recorded selection into the older and quieter region where the first decisions about what would be remembered were made by people whose names are themselves no longer known. What remains, in the end, is not a complete account of the past, but a curated fragment of it, shaped by hands that did not always identify themselves. There is a particular hour, late enough that the world outside has grown quiet, but not yet so late that sleep has fully arrived, when the questions raised by all of this begin to feel less like academic puzzles and more like something closer to a personal disquiet. The disquiet is not unpleasant exactly. It has the quality of standing at the edge of a deep, still body of water at night, knowing that the surface reflects back only the immediate surroundings, and that beneath the reflection there is a darkness whose depth cannot be measured from where one stands. Atlantis, in the end, may be best understood as that surface, not as a place that can be located on any map, not as a civilization that can be reconstructed from any set of recovered artifacts, but as the visible shape that the great unknown beneath history takes when human attention is paid to it. The trail that this account has followed has not produced an answer. It was never going to. The question of whether a specific city, organized in concentric rings beyond the Pillars of Heracles, was destroyed in a single dreadful interval roughly 9,600 years before the Common Era, cannot be settled by the evidence currently available and may never be settled at all. What the trail has produced instead is something less satisfying and, in its own way, more substantial. It has produced a sense of the texture of what is actually known and what is actually unknown about the deep past of the human species. And that texture, examined honestly, is rougher and more discontinuous than the smooth narratives of either popular skepticism or popular speculation tend to allow. The Earth, it now appears, was capable of dramatic and rapid environmental change at the threshold of the Holocene. The ice cores have made this undeniable. The seas rose, sometimes gradually and sometimes in sudden pulses that would have been visible within a single human lifetime. The continental shelves, where they stood exposed during the long cold of the last glacial maximum, were inhabited, and the inhabitants did not always have the option of orderly retreat. Some places, like Doggerland, drowned over the course of generations. Some places drowned more suddenly, by tsunami or by accelerated rise. The map of where human beings actually lived during the late Pleistocene is not the map that survives in the archaeological record, because much of that map is now seabed, and seabed archaeology is in its infancy. At the same time, the capabilities of pre-agricultural and early agricultural societies appear to have been greater than the older models acknowledged. Göbekli Tepe stands as a quiet rebuke to the assumption that monumental construction required the prior establishment of farming. The megalithic traditions of Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond suggest networks of maritime contact and accumulated technical knowledge that span thousands of kilometers and persist for thousands of years. The astronomical alignments encoded in stone across multiple regions imply systems of celestial observation that the inheriting cultures often could no longer fully decode. The Maltese temple builders flourished for a millennium and then disappeared. The builders of Stonehenge transported stones from quarries hundreds of kilometers away by methods that remain partially mysterious. None of this proves Atlantis. All of it suggests that the deep past was more crowded with achievement than the inherited timelines have allowed. Memory, too, may run deeper than the older skepticism assumed. The case of the Cascadia tsunami, where indigenous oral tradition preserved the date and character of an event that occurred 3 centuries before any written record reached the relevant communities, demonstrated that oral transmission can be more accurate than was once thought. The studies of Australian Aboriginal coastal traditions have raised the possibility, not yet fully accepted but no longer easily dismissed, that some traditions may preserve specific environmental information across spans of 7,000 to 10,000 years or more. If even a portion of these claims survives further scrutiny, then the temporal gap between Plato's writing and the latest plausible date for the events his account describes is no longer prohibitive. The gap can be bridged by oral tradition, in principle. Whether it actually was bridged in this particular case remains uncertain. And then there is the curated quality of all surviving knowledge, the recognition that the historical record is not a neutral repository, but the residue of decisions made by institutions about what would be allowed to persist. The Library of Alexandria, the Mayan codices, the Druidic traditions, the Gnostic writings, the libraries of Baghdad. Each loss represents a different episode in a long pattern of deliberate erasure, and each loss raises the question of what older erasures, performed in periods that left no record of their own decisions, may have shaped the inherited story of the deep past in ways that are now invisible. The history that any generation receives is, in part, the history that previous generations chose to allow it to receive. What was filtered out in the millennia before any institution capable of recording its own filtering existed cannot now be known. What does it mean, then, to ask whether Atlantis was real? The question, framed in that simple binary form, may not be the right question. A more honest framing might run something like this. Were there, in the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, human communities of greater organizational sophistication than the conventional model has allowed for, occupying landscapes that were subsequently lost to rising seas, whose memory may have been preserved in fragmentary and distorted form in the traditions of the cultures that came after them? To this question, the available evidence permits a tentative and uncomfortable answer. Yes, probably, at least in some places, to some degree, in ways that cannot at present be reconstructed in detail. This is not the dramatic Atlantis of popular imagination, with its concentric harbours and orichalcum walls and 10 kings descended from Poseidon. It is something quieter, and in its own way, more troubling. It is the recognition that the human story is older and more complicated than the inherited narrative has acknowledged, that significant portions of that story have been lost in ways that may not be fully recoverable, and that the impulse to dismiss the traditions which preserve hints of the loss has perhaps been more confident than the available evidence warrants. Plato's island, in the end, may not have existed in the form he described, but the world that produced his account, the world in which Egyptian priests could plausibly claim to remember things the Greeks had forgotten, the world in which flood myths echoed across cultures that had never met, the world in which monuments stood whose builders the inheriting peoples could no longer name, that world was real, and what survives of it, in the careful phrasing of an unfinished dialogue, in the carved silence of an Anatolian hillside, in the streets of a sunken Greek town, in the stories of an Australian coastline, in the rings of a desert formation that resembles something it is not, in the absence where libraries once stood. What survives is perhaps not the answer to the question of Atlantis. It is the question itself, refusing to settle, refusing to drown, refusing to be wholly remembered or wholly forgotten. The water continues its slow work. The stones continue their long silence. And somewhere between the two, in the territory that belongs neither fully to history nor fully to myth, the lamp on the surface of the deep flickers, and goes on flickering long after the eyes that first lit it have closed.